When Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed up to 12,000 North Korean soldiers into Russia, he must have thought he'd scored a valuable coup. Not only had he secured some much-needed manpower he could use to retake Kursk, but these weren't any old North Korean soldiers. Many were members of the Storm Corps, North Korea's elite special forces operatives who specialize in subterfuge and infiltrating behind enemy lines. But there's a problem for Russia's president. The soldiers he received from North Korea are far less competent than he was led to believe, and they're so lost on the battlefield that Ukrainian special forces are able to hunt them down and take them out almost at will. That's exactly what happened on January 13th, 2025. It seems an entire North Korean platoon has been destroyed in Kursk, and Ukraine soldiers have transformed into the hunters of Russia's new troops. In this video, we're going to explore what happened when Ukraine's special forces located the North Korean platoon, what we've learned about the North Korean soldiers in Kursk so far, and why these soldiers aren't performing anywhere near as well as Putin had hoped. We start with the engagement. On January 13th, the Kyiv Independent was among the first to report that Ukraine's Special Operations Forces had fought off an assault carried out by North Korean troops in the Kursk Oblast. Ukraine's press service delivered the gory details. A single engagement led to the deaths of 17 of Putin's North Korean contingent. This platoon had been deployed in the Kursk Oblast, along with thousands more North Koreans, to help Russia counter the Ukrainians that had invaded the territory back in August 2024. Ukraine has been engaged in a brave defense of that territory ever since, with the goal seeming to be to hold on to Kursk so it can be used as a bargaining chip should Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ever start peace negotiations. The battle with the North Korean platoon was a long one, lasting from morning until night. The engagement saw the Ukrainian Special Forces operatives actively hunting down the North Korean soldiers to take them out. Video footage of the operation has also emerged, though it shows little of the more graphic detail. Instead, we see Ukrainian soldiers patrolling through wooded areas, marking out the locations of the North Korean soldiers as they go. In scenes that look like they were pulled out of the Blair Witch Project, the Ukrainians navigate through trees and even come across what appears to be small abandoned buildings in the forest. At various points, you can see the Special Forces operatives close in on a North Korean position. A rifle is raised, a shot is fired. Then, the Ukrainians move on to locate the next target. Ukraine's Special Forces are far from being desperate defenders of the land they've taken from Russia. They have become hunters of North Korean troops, able to navigate dense woodland to pick out Putin's imported soldiers almost at will. As dramatic music blares, we see more footage of the trees through which the Ukrainians needed to identify the North Korean soldiers. Ukraine has a clear advantage. It's fought in these types of locations for almost 3 years as it battles against Russia. As for North Korea's soldiers, all they try to do is survive the encounter so they can live to fight another day. None made it out alive on January 13th. Some North Koreans, their bodies blurred out, are shown dead or dying in the video. Not shown in the footage is what happened when a Ukrainian mopping up group followed the special forces to try to locate and potentially capture any North Koreans who were left standing. That group encountered one of Putin's imported soldiers, but rather than giving himself up to the Ukrainians, the soldier attempted to guide them away from their position into a poorly laid trap. The trap didn't spring as the Ukrainian soldiers were too smart to fall for that trick. That didn't matter to the North Korean. He pulled the pin on the grenade he'd hoped to use to take some of the Ukrainians with him, fatally injuring himself to avoid capture. The new Voice of Ukraine provides a few more details about the engagement. It learned that the Special Forces group sent to hunt down the North Korean platoon were all members of the 6th SSO Regiment. The SSO even reported on the ill-fated North Korean who attempted to lay a trap for the mopping-up team. The North Korean soldier tried to deceive the Ukrainian Special Forces and detonate a grenade as they approached. However, our soldiers detected the danger in time and moved out of the blast radius, avoiding casualties, read the report. And therein lies the story of this encounter. A Ukrainian Special Forces unit engaged an entire North Korean platoon. The Ukrainians survived with no casualties while all of the North Koreans died. A gulf in skill is evident here, and it's a problem that Putin is going to find he experiences more and more as he tries to use North Korean President Kim Jong-un's poorly trained troops to retake Kursk. Worst of all for Putin, this isn't the first time that Ukraine's special forces have taken out a North Korean platoon. On January 8th, news emerged of a previous encounter during which a Ukrainian special operations team managed to kill 13 North Korean soldiers. The Ukrainians used a combination of drone warfare and small arms fire to achieve their victory, with the former method killing 8 of the North Korean soldiers, while the small arms fire eliminated a further 5. What's most notable about this earlier encounter is what the Ukrainian special forces found on the bodies of the soldiers they had neutralized. The Ukrainians discovered that one of the soldiers was carrying an assault rifle, presumably of Russian origin, along with a Russian radio and a drone detection device. All evidence that Putin is not only accepting soldiers from Kim, but that he's equipping them with Russian weapons. Whether this is because North Korean weapons are judged unfit for purpose, or because the imported soldiers are arriving without any weapons of their own, is yet to be determined. There was one more interesting thing about this earlier engagement. It appears that at least one of the 13 North Korean soldiers killed was an officer. The Ukrainian Special Forces located an identification card on one of the bodies that differed from the regular military IDs the rest of the soldiers had. That possible officer was also carrying a letter of appeal to the Workers' Party of North Korea, the party that President Kim leads, that appears to be part of a non-disclosure agreement that each North Korean soldier has to sign before they're shipped off to Russia. So we have news of two grim encounters between Ukrainian Special Forces and North Korean platoons. Two encounters in which the North Koreans clearly came out on the losing end. That appears to be the story for North Korea's forces in the Kursk region so far. These two encounters are indicative of a war in which North Korea is losing soldiers at an alarming rate. On January 13th, the same day as news emerged of the first engagement we spoke about, the Kyiv Independent reported that at least 300 North Korean soldiers had already died in Kursk, with a further 2,700 being wounded. Those figures come from South Korea's National Intelligence Service, or NIS, and they follow recent comments made by Zelensky that North Korea had suffered 4,000 casualties in Kursk. Whichever side is correct doesn't really make a difference. The numbers show that the North Korean contingent of up to 12,000 soldiers has lost between a quarter and a third of its entire number in just a couple of months of fighting inside Russia. It appears that Putin's meat grinder approach isn't limited to his soldiers fighting in Donetsk. NIS says this massive casualty rate is a result of the North Korean soldiers' lack of understanding of modern warfare, along with their useless attempts to shoot down the fast-moving Ukrainian drones that are so often used to devastate their units. The NIS also confirmed what the January 13th engagement between Ukraine and a North Korean platoon revealed. North Korean soldiers are being told to kill themselves to avoid being captured by Ukraine. And that brings us to what we've learned so far about North Korea's soldiers from these engagements. They're clearly tactically inept and appear to be using unfamiliar weapons on the Kursk battlefield. Russia is having to equip them with everything, which means the soldiers are essentially being forced to learn on the job as they're thrust onto the front lines. Naturally, they lose when facing up against the more battle-hardened and experienced Ukrainian forces. And if one of the North Koreans survives an encounter, only to be found by one of Ukraine's mopping-up teams, their only option, one drilled into them throughout their time in Kursk, is to die rather than surrender. That places a new context on the North Korean soldiers' attempts to kill Ukrainians with a grenade in the January 13th encounter. This wasn't some last act of bravery from a soldier who was willing to go out on his shield. It was a meek attempt to kill at least a couple of Ukrainians in an explosion that was always going to happen because the North Korean soldier had been told that he had to die. North Korea is no more sympathetic when revealing the news of these deaths to the families of the soldiers sent to Kursk. According to an anonymous North Korean source, the first death certificates of those who perished on the Kursk battlefield were handed out to families on December 18, 2024. However, the delivery of this grim news wasn't conducted in the respectful manner you would expect. There was a knock on the door and no grief counselor available to help the families of the dead soldiers through their trying times. Instead, each family of a dead soldier was summoned to a provincial party event held by the party committee that oversees their nearest city. Once at the event, the families received the death certificates, being blindsided by the news of a loss of a loved one, while also being surrounded by other newly grieving families. Each was told that the soldier in their family had been killed while taking part in sacred military exercises on which the honor of the motherland depended. Again, no mention of fighting in Russia, as both Putin and Kim seem to be desperately trying to cover up the presence of North Korean soldiers in Kursk. But with that, we come to another question. Why are so many North Korean soldiers being killed in Kursk? After all, many of these soldiers are supposed to be members of the elite Storm Corps. Also known as the 11th Corps, these soldiers are supposedly trained in infiltration, specialists in assassination, and capable of sabotaging infrastructure. All key skills that Putin could use to weaken Ukraine's defenses in Kursk. Michael Madden of the Stimson Center says that each Storm Corps soldier is trained to withstand a high degree of physical pain and psychological torture. That second point may explain why North Koreans are willing to blow themselves up with grenades rather than be captured. Russia has these forces specifically because of this mental acumen, with Madden adding that what the Storm Corps lacks in combat, they make up for with what they can tolerate physically and mentally. But as we're seeing in Kursk, the reality of what the Storm Corps can do is much different from the carefully crafted image North Korea has created of its elite forces. And the reason is that practically everything we thought we knew about North Korea's elite soldiers comes from propaganda. They are actually poorly trained and far less capable than Kim would have us and perhaps Putin believe. That's according to a former North Korean soldier named Ryu Seong-hyun, who spoke to Dimple Video about his experience serving in his country's military and what we're now seeing in Kursk. And one of the first things he highlights is that Kim's love of flair masks the fact that his best soldiers aren't even trained to the same standard as basic infantry in other countries. If you watch the news, they introduce it in a really grandiose way, says Ryu. But in reality, it's nothing special. The Storm Corps, as you can imagine, is just breaking bricks with their heads and smashing stones against their stomachs. But modern warfare isn't a video game. Their stomachs can still be pierced by bullets. This harkens back to the NIS's comments that North Korean troops aren't prepared for modern warfare. While Ukraine has innovated constantly in its fight against Russia, in particular showcasing how drones can be used to strike everything from human targets to tanks and ships, North Korea's soldiers seem to be preparing for hand-to-hand combat in scenes that could be pulled out of a martial arts movie. Sure, breaking bricks with your head might show that you're somewhat tough, but as the former North Korean soldier puts it, when would there ever be a need to headbutt something in urban warfare? Ryu also reveals that North Korea's criteria for electing its Storm Corps members is far from impressive. In terms of physicality, they select soldiers who are mostly over 165 centimeters tall, approximately 5 feet and 5 inches, so their physical preparedness is superior to other units. There's a certain logic there. Kim wants what he views as the strongest and tallest warriors in his elite forces to create an intimidating factor. But 5 feet and 5 inches is far from tall, when compared to the average 5 foot 11 inches for men in Ukraine. It's also a short-sighted approach. North Korea is likely missing out on a lot of its brightest minds because the people who have them don't fit the physical requirements for the Storm Corps. North Korea is also dangling a carrot on the end of the stick for the soldiers it sends to Russia. If these soldiers gain real combat experience and return to North Korea, they are highly likely to be promoted as commanders in the military, says Ryu. Again, we see the gulf in quality between North Korea's military and many others. Simply having any experience in combat is enough to gain commander status, which is perhaps no surprise in a country that hasn't been involved in a large-scale conflict since the Korean War, which ended in 1953. The ex-soldier also revealed that even the Storm Corps are poorly trained and starving for most of their time in North Korea, and the situation hasn't gotten much better for them since arriving in Kursk. I saw on the news that soldiers deployed to Ukraine couldn't receive food supplies and ended up in a difficult situation. Starvation, it seems, is normal throughout the North Korean military ranks. And the former soldier interviewed by Dimple Video isn't the first to highlight this problem. Speaking to the BBC in December 2024, another ex-soldier in North Korea's military revealed that the Storm Corps constantly lacked food. Hanul, who served in North Korea's elite unit, says that he lost around 22 pounds during his first month of service as he was forced to make do with a diet of moldy cabbage and cracked corn. Things didn't get much better once he was deployed as a frontline guide in a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Food would typically be passed through the rear units first, with the rice that replaced corn being cut with sand by the time that it reached the elite soldiers at the front. I believe the situation in the North Korean military is even worse than in an actual wartime scenario, Ryu adds. It's because North Korea is currently unable to farm properly, he says, pointing out that North Korea lacks fertilizers and suffers from regular droughts. Even the country's mountains are barren, says Ryu, and those who live in the shadows of those mountains have to deal with landslides and erosion, all of which prevent them from obtaining military supplies in good time. It just gets worse for the Storm Corps. Not only is the majority of their training geared around a form of fighting in which they simply won't engage when in Kursk, but they're starving both before and after they arrive in Russia. North Korea doesn't have enough food to feed them. The latter issue also creates a less obvious impact on a Storm Corps soldier's ability to be useful on the battlefield. The time spent on farming often exceeds the time spent on military training, says Ryu, hinting that even the best of the soldiers in North Korea spend most of their time simply trying to get food into their stomachs. And all of that time spent on farming is to the detriment of real combat training. Military training ultimately depends on whether soldiers can move uniformly under a commander's single order, says Ryu. Climbing ropes, scaling walls, or breaking bricks isn't what I would consider real military training. While the former soldier may not be wholly accurate here, climbing is often part of basic training obstacle courses. He's making the point that North Korea's military uses this type of training to replace something that could be actually useful to the soldiers Kim shipped to Putin, learning how to fire a gun. A North Korean soldier in training barely ever uses a rifle in live-fire situations, meaning they don't know how to use the very weapons with which they're supposed to be fighting Ukraine's very experienced forces. But hey, at least they're so disciplined and indoctrinated that they don't even realize that their training is substandard until it's too late. By now, we're gaining plenty of context as to why Ukraine's special forces have been able to eliminate entire platoons of North Korean soldiers multiple times in Kursk. The reality is that it's something of an unfair fight. The North Koreans aren't trained for the situation in which they now find themselves. They can barely even fire their weapons. All they have is propaganda of being able to break bricks with their heads and smash stones with their stomachs. Ukraine has drones and experienced soldiers. Of course it's hunting down and destroying the North Korean soldiers. But all of this raises other questions. If Putin and Kim know that the North Korean soldiers in Kursk aren't up to the job, why did North Korea send them in the first place? And why is there now speculation that Kim intends to send even more soldiers to Russia using a rotation model that could lead to a fresh supply of thousands of new troops in Kursk every few months? For Putin, the answer is simple. He doesn't necessarily need experienced or talented soldiers. Simply having more cannon fodder to feed into his meat grinder is enough, as it allows him to wear down Ukraine's resources until Russia overwhelms the Kursk fortifications. As for Kim, it's all about what he can get from Russia in return. I think Kim Jong-un wants to send 100,000 North Korean soldiers, not just 10,000. Right now, what Kim needs the most is money, and I believe the main goal is to send personnel overseas to learn various technologies, gain war experience, and earn money, says Ryu. That's going to be a problem both for Ukraine and North Korea's military going forward. Kim's money-first approach means he's willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of his own troops just to get his hands on a little more cash from Moscow, weakening his military at home in the process. For Ukraine, that means dealing with potentially thousands of new North Korean soldiers every few months as it tries to keep the territory it's defending in Kursk. Still, we now know just how effective Ukraine's special forces can be when they go on the hunt for North Korean platoons. The two engagements we've highlighted here combine to result in the deaths of 30 North Koreans, including at least one officer and likely several members of the elite Storm Corps. If Kim sends more soldiers to Russia, that will just mean that the SSO has more opportunities to hunt. But what do you think about Ukraine's annihilation of entire North Korean platoons? Are they indicative of the terrible training and rampant indoctrination that these soldiers experience in North Korea? Do Kim and Putin even care that so many North Korean soldiers are dying? Or are they happy for the sacrifices to be made as long as each gets what he wants from the other? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, and thank you for watching the video.